report found a former player was racially abused. The LBC Markets report in the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 26 points at 72.74. The pound buys $1.36 and €1.17. LBC weather, central and southern areas cloudy with drizzle tonight. Fog in Northern Ireland and showers for northern England and Scotland. A low of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Lucinda Horsley.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:03 on LBC. Welcome to Cross Question. It's Tuesday evening, and in the studio with me tonight are Kate Hoey, Baroness Kate Hoey, I should say, Gordon Rayner, Associate Editor of the Daily Telegraph, Daisy Cooper, Liberal Democrat MP for St Albans and their party's Deputy Leader, and Kate Green, Shadow Education Secretary and Labour MP for Stretford and Urmston. They're here to take your questions. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call, and of course you can watch us on Global Player on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk or the LBC Facebook and YouTube channels.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. I can imagine you probably guessed the subject of the first question, so let's go to Claire in Haringey. Hello, Claire.
Hello there, Ian. Thank you.
Hi.
My question is, would the panel agree that an unvaccinated person working in a hospital with vulnerable patients is equivalent to second-hand smoke injuring non-smokers?
That's a great question. It's almost impossible to answer. But now, Daisy, you also speak for the Lib Dems on health matters, so let's come to you first.
Thanks. I mean, it is a great question. I think I guess the straight answer would be, no, I don't think it is comparable, and I'll happily sort of try and explain why that is. I think the first thing to say is that anybody going into a medical setting or anybody who has somebody in care will want to know that they're being treated by somebody who is either fully jabbed or is taking regular tests to make sure that they don't have COVID. I think the critical question around whether or not vaccines should be mandatory is, will making vaccinations mandatory for health workers drive up the number of people that get the jab, or will it push people out of the profession? And the honest answer is at the moment that we're not quite sure.
Well, there is evidence from other countries, isn't there? If you look at France, for example, immediately there was a rise in the number of health workers getting the vaccination. And I think I read last weekend that only 0.1% of people had left the profession.
Well, since this policy was announced in June, I think it was the 16th of June, the government first announced this policy, there has been an increase in the number of people in care and in the NHS that have got their vaccinations, but there are still a number of people that haven't. And today we actually quizzed the government on why that was. So we said there's about 100,000 people, about 10% of people in the NHS that aren't fully jabbed, and we were asking the Secretary of State to tell us why. How many of those people are medically exempt? How many of them have maybe had jabs in another country and maybe they haven't had their chance to have them here? How many of them are long-term sick? And what are the barriers to getting those people to be jabbed? I would much rather encourage the government and have the government putting time and effort into allowing anybody that has vaccine hesitancy to actually have a chat with a doctor, because the evidence also shows that where people do have hesitancy for whatever reason, sitting down with a doctor, having their questions answered is the best way of driving up the jab. So I would much rather have that level of encouragement.
They've had a year to do that, haven't they? And you think, well, if they haven't done it in the last year, why would they do it now?
Well, this is precisely why we need to have more data from the government about why it is that this 100,000 people, about 10% left of staff in the NHS, why it is that they haven't got jabbed. And until we know the data around how many of those are medically exempt and how many aren't, we really don't know what the scale of the problem is that we're dealing with. So we need that data to be able to make a decision. But as I say, I would much rather we encourage people to take up the jab rather than taking this compulsory approach.
Gordon Rayner.
Well, to go back to the question, I think you could argue it's worse, because if somebody is passively smoking, they're not going to die straight away. Whereas if somebody gets COVID, they could die straight away. Today's Telegraph reported on 11,600 hospital-acquired COVID deaths, or deaths of people who acquired COVID in hospital. That's enough to fill a small football stadium. I can't quite understand the logic or the thinking of people who work in the health service who don't trust vaccinations. If you're a surgeon, I believe you have to, or it's more or less compulsory to have a hepatitis jab. That's never been controversial. I don't really see why this is so controversial that health workers should be jabbed.
Well, I suppose there'll be many of your readers who will take a very libertarian point of view and say, well, how dare the government tell me what I do with my body?
Yeah, I mean, one suggestion that I saw today was health workers having badges saying whether they've been vaccinated or not, and patients being able to say, well, I'm happy to be treated by somebody who's been vaccinated or unvaccinated. Patients have a choice as well. So as much as there's a libertarian angle to it, what about the rights of the patients to be treated by somebody who doesn't have COVID?
I just think of a yellow star when I hear that.
But you're talking about people who go into hospital to get better, and as we saw today, 11,000 of them may have gone into hospital and died as a result. That surely has to be the priority.
Kate, where do the Labour Party stand on this?
Well, this is really personal for me, Iain, actually, because my mum died in a care home of COVID, and we think that the infection came in because of a care worker who hadn't had the vaccine. Now, at the time, it was very early in the vaccination programme. I in no way blame the staff who did a wonderful job looking after my mum. So, of course, like Daisy, I want to see NHS workers taking up the vaccine. And I think our priority has to be to encourage, but I don't think it's just about encouraging. I think it's also about making it really easy for them to do so. So if they're working shifts and they can't get access to vaccine centres, which might seem a bizarre thing to say about someone working in the NHS, but we know that in some parts of the country that has been an issue. If they have different responsibilities, that means that the opening times for the vaccine centres don't work for them. We've got to remove all the barriers first, and I think that really needs to be the priority. Iain, the Labour Party doesn't think we should be starting from the position of mandatory vaccines. We should be starting by the persuasion and information, as Daisy says, and facilitating to make it as easy as possible. Of course, my heart says I wish that my mum was still with me. I wish that care worker had the vaccine. I wish my mum had the vaccine. But we can't make policy just on the basis of our hearts. And Daisy's quite right. What we've seen in care homes is staff leaving and a huge shortage now of care staff. So I would just say to the government, be very, very careful and thoughtful if this is the policy that you're going to implement.
Is this actually going to be voted on in the House of Commons?
I don't know, and Daisy may know. Daisy's nodding and saying it is. We certainly had a vote when it came to the vote on care workers, and it was a very difficult vote, and for many of us very personal, but it is incumbent on us as lawmakers to make sure that we examine all the angles before we pass a law.
The odd thing, Kate Hoey, is that they're saying you don't have to get the jabs until the 1st of April next year. Well, that's 6 months away. Now, having told care workers they had to get the jab within a relatively short time, I don't understand why the delay, but also do address the question.
Well, that's exactly the point, actually, I was going to make. I can't understand April, because obviously the next few months are the really dangerous times in winter. But I think that may well be, I think probably the Secretary of State did give some reason for that today in terms of time and not wanting to lose people. But also, I think there is probably a reluctance within government to do this. I'm sure there is. But so they hope that by putting that deadline in April, that between now and then all the things that everyone else has talked about, the persuasion, the idea that, I actually quite like the idea of someone being able to tell their patient whether they've been vaccinated or not. But I do feel very conflicted by it, because, there is the worry that you start with this and then what else will it be in the future? And, you are having something put into your own body that in a way is very personal. And I understand exactly why, and particularly, in great sympathy with Kate and what has happened to so many people in care homes. But I just think we have to be very, very careful, and it needs, a real debate. Now, funny enough, sorry to mention it right away, but in Northern Ireland today, they've just announced a consultation on exactly this, a public consultation, which I don't think is going to last very long, but at least it gives people the opportunity to say what they think.
There has been a consultation in England for the last 2 months.
Well, what did it say?
I've no idea.
Exactly.
They consulted, and people who had a view presumably were free to make their views known.
Well, yes, but those kind of things aren't, you really have to, if you're serious about getting public opinion, you have to go out there and work to get it. And I don't know, I certainly wasn't asked.
Well, why do you think that this whole issue has become such a... I mean, you're either on one side or the other, and it's not quite as simple as being, well, you're either pro-vaccination or anti-vax. There are sort of shades of grey in between, I guess. But it's become a big political football, sort of on the extremes, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, it shouldn't be, and it should be something, we're always talking in politics about working across party on issues that really matter. This is something that there should be really cross-party discussion on, and a feeling that this is something that is taking us into the realms of doing things that we haven't done before. But also, I think there's so much different views coming out on the science of all of this. I mean, I understood that being vaccinated was to protect me. And, obviously, if all these people have been vaccinated and transmission is still going up, then clearly it's not necessarily
But it isn't
protecting.
going up. The R rate is actually, we now apparently, I was reading yesterday, we have one of the lowest R rates in Europe. The R rate doesn't seem to be discussed anymore, and I've never quite understood why that is. It is very odd. Well, thank you very much for that question, Claire. We've got a very, very interesting question coming up with Maya in Tottenham, but let's first go to a break. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
Past 8, you're listening to or watching Cross Question. Don't forget you can watch on Global Player or the LBC website at lbc.co.uk. Kate Hoey is with us, Gordon Rayner from the Telegraph, Daisy Cooper, Deputy Leader of the Lib Dems, and Kate Green, Labour's Shadow Education spokesperson. Now, if you'd like to ask our panel a question, you know the number, 0345 6060 973. I thought our switchboard will be deluged with questions on sleaze tonight. But we're going to go to a different subject first. Maya is in Tottenham. Hello, Maya.
Hello.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
I would just like to ask the panel, what does the panel think of the way Poland is handling the current situation on its border with Belarus? Should Poland be condemned or applauded for the way it is handling the current situation?
Just tell us how Poland is handling the situation.
You want me to tell you how they're handling it?
I do, yes. Well, from your point of view, how do you think it's handling it? And what is it doing?
Well, it's brought in the military and it's resisting. From what the images I have seen, they have called in the military and they are not letting the people who want to come in. And there have been, I think some people have said they've heard gunshots and... I mean, some people, I can only say what I've seen from the images, and I'm sure the whole panel has seen the images, and I'm sure they have an opinion on whether Poland should be condemned or should be applauded or...
Right, well, let's ask them. Gordon Rayner, let's start with you.
Can I just ask you, Maya, do you have a personal connection to Poland or Belarus?
No, I don't have a personal connection to either.
Okay. Well, I think this is a huge test for the EU because it's effectively a migration crisis. You've got a dictator and a bully who has basically invited people from all over the world, but obviously we're talking about countries in the Middle East, primarily Iraq, Iran, Russia to a certain extent. He's effectively got an open door policy. He's made it clear that people can come to Belarus, that he won't do anything to stop them crossing the border. He's got a beef with Europe, and so he's punishing Europe by effectively just opening the border so that they can flood into Poland. Now, it's not really a problem that Poland should have to be dealing with on its own. This is the EU's border in the same way that Greece has had to deal with a migration crisis without too much help from the EU there. And so really, I think we need to hear from Brussels what exactly they propose to do about it, because it shouldn't be down to Poland to deal with it all on their own.
Kate Green, obviously the EU have imposed sanctions on Belarus already. They're threatening more sanctions. Britain has imposed sanctions as well. Maybe we should be playing a bit of a lead here as well.
Well, I do think that there should be a strong international response. I do think that Poland and the EU and other countries too have the right to protect their borders. But obviously, it's an absolutely horrific situation with, exactly as Gordon says, strongman tactics from President Lukashenko in Belarus, deliberately aimed at annoying and punishing, as he would see it, Europe, and innocent people are going to be the victims in the middle of all of this. Innocent people who may be moving across countries because they're desperate, because they need to find work or safety, and they're being used as pawns, totally unacceptably, by President Lukashenko. And I think it is incumbent on the whole international community, the EU, the UK, and other international players, to say that this kind of bullying behaviour and using people in this way will not be tolerated, and sanctions are the right response for the EU, but it may be we need to look for stronger measures.
Kate Hoey.
Well, I think Poland's right to be stopping people coming in those numbers and completely unchecked. There are probably some people listening who say, we should be doing the same with people coming over from France. I went down last week, and I mean, that's another story. I was quite horrified by what I saw there. But however, it's absolutely right. It's an international situation now. I'm not even sure how strong the sanctions were against Belarus, but clearly they're going to have to be looked at again. And if the EU makes them tougher, I expect these are the kinds of issues that, even though we've left the European Union, we would want to cooperate and work with. But it's going to be a problem if those people come through to Poland, because then there will be an open door to the rest of EU, and eventually we will end up in this country with a lot of people coming. So it really is something that needs to be brought very high up the list of our Foreign Secretary and what she's doing.
Okay, Daisy?
Well, this is an international situation, as others have said, and I think the risk of military escalation is really very worrying. At the heart of this, we have, as I understand it, some migrants who weren't just invited in a welcoming way. They were invited as a political tool, effectively, to try and manipulate and create this political situation. And if that really is the case, then I think it's absolutely unforgivable that incredibly vulnerable people can be exploited for political ends in this way. So we do need to see a firm response from the EU and from others. And I think we need to have quick condemnation of what's going on both sides, quite frankly. We need efforts to de-escalate the situation, and then some very quick action to actually rescue the very vulnerable people who are stuck in the middle between two hostile actors who are hostile with each other.
What should Poland do? Because, I mean, Poland's on the front line here. They're clearly trying to resist people coming in through fairly strong measures, shall we say. Do you feel that they're doing this in the right way?
I think it's hard to say. We've only seen a sort of few images coming through on the news. I think Poland, as a member of the EU, needs to be asking the EU for assistance in this matter. The EU has a lot of political weight in terms of speaking to other countries and mobilising an international response to this. Clearly, it's a very tricky position on that immediate border. I think first and foremost, there has to be a way of looking after those people who are very vulnerable. We need to see the UN
November
refugee.
on the Belarus-Poland border, I imagine, is slightly different in temperature terms to what we are experiencing in London at the moment.
Precisely, and that's why we need to see potentially the UN refugee organisation and others coming in to help those people who are so vulnerable, and then we see de-escalation after that.
Well, whether Belarus lets them in or not, of course, that's the other issue. But also it's quite interesting because Poland, of course, is not the EU's favourite country. Now we've left, so they're in quite a conflict. So it'll be very interesting. This is going to test the EU, isn't it, in terms of where its loyalty lies.
Maya, quick word from you again.
I mean, some of your panel just haven't answered my question. One panel member said we should look after the people. Well, if you look after them, will they not then more come? Because, hey, if you go over there, they will even look after us. Would that not be a signal for even more people to come? Because a similar thing happened with the crossings in 2015. We had people coming over in boats, and that became a kind of taxi service. So, I mean, would that not encourage more to come over?
Daisy?
There is one very simple way of stopping people desperately trying to cross the channel and get into countries in these desperate ways, and that is to create safe legal routes. It would be entirely possible for our government to set up a safe legal route so that people who want to come to this country can, from the safety of another country, apply to come here. But systematically, this Conservative government have closed down those safe legal routes, meaning that people have resorted to these very desperate ways of trying to get into the country.
How does that apply here? Because you're not going to get a safe legal route from Belarus to Poland, are you?
Well, I think Maya was trying to draw a comparison between what was happening on the border there with what's happening in the Channel, and I think the situations are actually quite different. So I was trying to address the one part, which is that to do with the Channel here in England, we have a way of dealing with this, and the government isn't using that simple way of dealing with it. The situation on the border between Poland and Belarus is very different, and as I say, this is a situation where you're not just dealing with people who are trying to come into the country of their own volition. It appears as though a government has invited them with the single purpose of creating a political fight, and that's a very different situation, so we shouldn't conflate the two.
OK, Maya, thank you very much. Let's move on to another question. Jerry's in Liverpool. Jerry, hello, you're a new caller. What would you like to ask?
Hi, Iain. Yeah, just at this exact moment, someone just knocked at the door. It's OK. I'm sorry about that, I'm out of breath. But what about to that? Is it Geoffrey Cox?
Yeah, Tory MP.
Is he still the Attorney General or the
No. Boris fired him when he was it when he became Prime Minister or shortly afterwards?
Yes, the first.
Can I ask you why did he fire him?
Because he wanted someone else to do the job, I guess.
Oh, there's no underlying reason.
I don't think. Well, can any Gordon? You were covering these things at the time.
I'm not aware. I mean, he was, he was a Theresa May appointment, and when prime ministers come in, they want to make their own appointments. So
and he wasn't a real strong Brexiteer. He looked it and pretended it. But
Nor was Boris, though, was he, Kate? He was wanting to.
Once Boris started, he started.
We actually haven't had Jerry's question yet. Jerry, go ahead.
I also wanted to ask, how come he'd be allowed to abuse the rules knowingly? He abused the rules knowing it was within the law, but he went to that limit knowingly.
Are you talking about the work that he's been doing in the British Virgin Islands? Well, he's working for the British Virgin Islands Prime Minister. We talked to Patrick Winter on the programme about that earlier. Well, he's not. The thing is, before we go to the panel, let's just clarify. As I understand it, and Gordon, you tell me if I'm wrong, he's not actually breaking any rules at all. As long as he declares how much he earns and how many hours he spends earning that money, and that is in the register of members' interest, no rules have been broken.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is remarkable. The idea of somebody voting by proxy from the British Virgin Islands using a system that was brought in to deal with COVID is something which I don't think the people who brought that system in would have occurred to them.
No, but I think if there was a detailed examination of everybody, I think you'd find people voted from all sorts of places.
Yeah, they may have done, but probably not.
Not from the Virgin Islands.
Not from the Virgin Islands. Not for weeks on end, and not while they were earning the sort of money that he was putting.
But do you think that there is? I mean, Number 10 seem to be rather distancing themselves from Geoffrey Cox tonight.
Yeah.
Do you think there are going to be some consequences from this?
Yeah, I think the whole issue of second jobs needs to be looked at, doesn't it? I don't think there is a necessarily a need to ban second jobs altogether. A lot of people have made the point that, we have GPs who sit as MPs. They are very valuable members of Parliament because they bring something to the table that nobody else can do. They need to work to keep up their registration. So I don't think you can have an outright ban. But I think you could certainly have perhaps a cap on the amount that you're allowed to earn, or you could have a cap on the number of days that you are allowed to work for somebody else, or you could even discuss having a ban on private sector work and only allow people who have public sector jobs like doctors to carry on.
We'll come to the other three panel members in just a moment. They can have a few minutes to ruminate on their answers. It's 8:30 on LBC. Lucinda Horsley has the news headlines.
Unions are warning making COVID jabs compulsory for NHS workers could further hit morale and force some to leave. The Health Secretary has confirmed frontline staff in England will face losing their jobs if they haven't had both doses by April. A mother's described her 10-year-old son as a beautiful boy after he was killed by a dog in South Wales yesterday. It's believed Jack Liss was attacked at a friend's house after school in Caerphilly. From Monday, people in Wales will have to show a COVID pass before being allowed to enter cinemas, theatres and concert halls. The rules already apply to those wanting to go to nightclubs, and extensions now being approved in the Welsh Parliament. LBC weather: central and southern areas cloudy with drizzle tonight. Fog in Northern Ireland and showers for Northern England and Scotland. A low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC.
You're listening to Cross Question. Gordon Rayner from the Telegraph is with us. Daisy Cooper is Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats. Kate Green is Shadow Education Spokesperson for the Labour Party. And Kate Hoey is Baroness Kate Hoey. Very popular on this programme, you always are, Kate. You always get a lot of reaction, both good and bad, I'll have to tell you. But you know that, don't you?
Yes.
You know what Twitter's like.
What, 75%, 25%?
I'd say it's more 50-50. Just the question that we're in the middle of answering is from Jerry in Liverpool, and he was asking why are the Conservatives defending their backbenchers whilst also breaking all the rules. Well, he was talking about Geoffrey Cox, and Gordon and I kind of agreed that people may find what he does distasteful, but he wasn't actually breaking any of the rules. Before I go to the rest of the panel, Gordon, you were on the Telegraph when the expenses scandal broke. You were sort of a leading player in that. Do you see any analogy between what's going on now and then? Because that really did hit home with the electorate, didn't it?
A little bit. I think one of the... It's interesting you say, this is all within the rules, because that was the number one excuse. In fact, it was what every MP involved in the expenses scandal said. They just said, well, it's all within the rules. I cleared it with the fees office. This feels a little bit like that in that sense. I think probably the difference is whether this has enough traction to carry on for a very long time. Expenses lasted for 6-7 weeks. It was just non-stop. I think it'll be interesting to see how many more calls you get on this, because that's a good gauge of whether it's bothering the public or not, because I just don't know.
Kate Green.
Yeah, well, it was certainly not Geoffrey Cox specifically, but the whole issue of corruption and the vote in Parliament that the government tried to fix last week was certainly coming up on doorsteps when I was knocking on constituents' doors at the weekend. And people are pretty disgusted, actually. They're disgusted at the corruption and the attempt to fix the rules or change the rules when somebody's caught out. They are pretty shocked and at this notion that people can think they can have 2, 3 or 4 very well-paid jobs and do an effective job as their constituency MP. And they do want much more transparency. It's why Labour thinks there does need to be an urgent investigation into Geoffrey Cox's conduct, not necessarily as a breach of Parliament's rules in terms of registering financial interests, but what was he doing in the British Virgin Islands at precisely the time that the Foreign Office is actually, investigating the Virgin Islands for instances of corruption. So I think all of this is playing into a really troubling perception that politics is corrupt, that politicians are corrupt. In fact, the vast majority of Daisy's and my colleagues are show complete integrity and dedication to their jobs and their constituents. But we have to stamp this out now because it is destroying confidence in our democracy. And that's why we do believe in Labour that we need a proper commission that would be responsible for stamping out corruption and ensuring absolute transparency in the roles that MPs take on, and why we would make sure that we had a proper Office for Public Value that would ensure that contracts aren't handed out, spending taxpayers' money to suit cronies of certain politicians.
Do we not have that already, the National Audit Office?
Well, we need a commission that's very specifically focused, not just on is it good value for money, but is it buying favours? Because that, I think, is deeply unacceptable.
The impression that a lot of Labour politicians have understandably given in many ways over the past few days that this is a Tory problem. Now, admittedly, the majority of the MPs that do have second or third jobs are Conservatives, but there are plenty of Labour MPs that do as well, including Keir Starmer, who apparently last month spent 17 hours on legal work. Now, I would have thought if you're leader of a political party, you should be spending all your time leading that political party.
So I think what we've particularly focused on, and Gordon talked about this a bit, which jobs are really egregious and do we have to stop them, not just because of the distraction in time, but because of the conflicts that they create between an MP's responsibility to their constituents and to our country and the people who are paying them to do other jobs. So as long ago as 2017, we had the Committee on Standards in Public Life saying that directorships and consultancies should not be permitted. They are an absolute route to creating conflicts of interest for MPs, taking payments and then going on to lobby or seek to persuade ministers to do things that are in the interests of their paymasters. I think it's absolutely right that there are other jobs, perhaps to keep up professional qualifications, that people can combine with serving their constituents.
But why is it wrong for Geoffrey Cox to take on outside legal work? when it isn't wrong for Keir Starmer to do. I mean, look, you're not going to criticise Keir Starmer. I get that.
Certainly.
You're in the shadow cabinet. I completely get that. But you have to admit that it looks a bit odd.
Well, I think it's a bit odd that Geoffrey Cox's legal work is working for a government that is facing an ongoing Foreign Office inquiry into alleged corruption. I don't think there's any suggestion at all that Keir's work or his client has any connection to corruption whatsoever.
Would you have time in your shadow cabinet role to take on extra work outside that? Because I suspect you wouldn't. If you're doing your job properly, you wouldn't, would you?
I think Keir's doing an excellent job as the leader of the Labour Party.
I was talking about you. I didn't ask whether you thought he was doing an excellent job.
Perhaps he's got an even higher capacity for work.
I'll leave it there. Ed Davey also earns £78,000. Now, his reasoning for that was that it all goes for the care of his disabled son. But you look at some of the way that some of the papers have covered that this morning, and they don't mention that. They've just got a picture of Ed Davey, £78,000.
Yeah, and that's a shame because Ed's been incredibly transparent about this since the get-go. Any additional money he earns goes directly towards the care of his son, who requires 24/7 care, and that will go for his care now and in the future. And because Ed knows just how difficult it is for carers like him, I would say he campaigns harder than any other MP from any party for the rights of the millions of carers that we have in this country, because he experiences it firsthand. But what the work that Ed does is entirely different from the situations we've been discussing. In the case of Owen Paterson broke the rules. He broke them incredibly badly. He refused to accept he'd broken them. He then had the opportunity to pay back the money, which he refused to do, and the sanction reflected that. And then at the 11th hour, Number 10 steps in, to try and completely rip up the rules, and he was allowed to have a vote on that. And in the case of Geoffrey Cox, as Kate said, he was in the British Virgin Islands for a month, whilst Parliament was sitting. That in itself, I think, is extraordinary. Then he was advising, as I understand it, the authorities there on how to get around British investigations and rules on corruption when we were debating them here in Parliament, which he should have been doing as a member. But in addition to that, this was during a pandemic. As an MP, I was out there trying to collect laptops for schools and sort out vaccine supplies and get PPE to care homes. The idea that he was actually in the British Virgin Islands for a month, I think, is just astonishing, and it wouldn't have occurred to me that we even had to legislate for behaviour like that, quite frankly.
Kate Hoey.
Well, ultimately, Geoffrey Cox will be judged by his constituents. If they really dislike what's happened, I imagine that his vote will certainly go down, or he might even lose his seat. And ultimately, the problem with any of this is that once you start to say, well, we'll allow some things, your suggestion that public sector, not private sector, or we'll allow, people who are only to earn a little bit, not a whole lot, or if it's for something that personal in the family, well, anyone can come up with some reason why they need to earn it. Every person who's probably doing an outside job could sit here and give a good reason why they're doing it. So I think it's going to be extremely difficult, even if, Kate got her way and there was commissions set up and all sorts of meetings and sort of agreements between the Speaker and all the parties to actually come up with something that in the end will not be able to be broken in some way or other. You either say nobody ever can earn a penny from anything else, and I'm afraid, or maybe some people might say it'd be a good idea, a lot of MPs will not stand again, because a lot of MPs are not going to put themselves through being an MP on what some of them, not me, I always thought we were extremely well paid, but some of them genuinely do think that they have to earn more. It's as simple as that. And the public will have to judge.
Someone on Twitter who calls himself Jakey Boy of Joy says, leave it to Iain to turn all of the talk about Conservative corruption into a chance to whine about Keir Starmer. No, I was actually, I think, asking a completely legitimate question.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's
I think even Kate would agree with that, wouldn't you?
I think the question is legitimate, but I think the case of Geoffrey Cox is in stark contrast to what Keir Starmer is doing.
It's a principle still.
Gordon.
I was just going to ask, as the only non-politician on the panel, isn't the reason that this never gets sorted out precisely the point that Iain's making, that MPs of every stripe do it, and therefore there is just no will in Parliament to get this fixed?
I don't know if that's absolutely right, Gordon. Many of us don't do it. I've never actually thought of doing it. And like Kate says, actually, we are very well paid. In my constituency, the average wage will be well below what I earn. And I'm very conscious of the great privilege of being their representative, but also that I'm paid well to do that. I think there are cases where people have good reasons for taking second jobs. We talked, for example, about people who need to maintain professional qualifications. I think we can make a judgment about the extent to which second jobs are really inimical against the interests of their constituents, and why would we want to support or permit MPs to take those jobs. What I think we need to do now is properly look at the situation that we find ourselves in after the events of last week, which have clearly horrified many of the public, and surely see if we can't do better than the situation we have now.
Let's get your reaction to this. This is from Ian Martin, the political journalist. He says Tory MP Andrew Bowie has resigned as Vice Chairman of the Conservative Party, according to several of his colleagues. One says he doesn't want to make a fuss, but he's unable to support the government after the events of recent days. Now that's quite damning. Andrew Bowie, regular on this programme, I think very nice guy. That's quite something to do, isn't it, Daisy, to resign from that kind of position? And I mean, even if he doesn't want to make a fuss about it, I'm sure the Daily Telegraph will be tomorrow morning.
Well,
Daisy first.
Sorry.
Sure. Well, I mean, Liberal Democrats secured an emergency debate in Parliament yesterday, and it was clear from that debate that there was a huge amount of frustration across the House, and particularly from the Conservatives' own backbenchers. They have been instructed by Number 10 last week to go and vote for this rule change. They got a huge backlash from their constituents. And we all got it in our inboxes, but they will have felt it, a lot more. There was a U-turn, which was then conducted, but then, of course, there was a whole muddle because the government then didn't table a motion to undo the thing they said they were trying to undo. And in the case of Owen Paterson was actually worse off after Number 10 got involved than he was before. So it's no wonder. And then, of course, there's been other revelations to do with other MPs as well about, invitations to parties and lobbying ministers to come to events and things. And, of course, we had the cash for honours allegations. I mean, it kind of goes on and on and on. So I'm not at all surprised that Andrew Bowie has resigned.
Gordon, your reaction?
Well, it's not a huge surprise. I was speaking to some Tory backbenchers today about this, and there is a huge amount of anger on the Tory backbenchers at the way this has all been handled. It's not about Geoffrey Cox so much. It's about the events of last week. It's about, as Daisy says, the whipping them to vote for something they didn't agree with, then doing a U-turn so that they lose all that support, and it was for nothing. There's a lot of anger about the Number 10 operation. They just feel that it's amateurish. They're not seeing problems coming up. They didn't predict that suggesting a cross-party committee to deal with this wouldn't work because the opposition parties would say we're not doing that, thus forcing the U-turn. This is quite basic stuff, and that's where the anger is coming from.
Friends of the Chief Whip are apparently making clear that he was instructed to do this by Boris Johnson. I mean, it comes to a pretty pass when the Prime Minister and the Chief Whip seem to be a little bit at odds. And of course, Boris Johnson hasn't got an opportunity now to make this right with his party because Parliament's now in recess for, 10 days now?
Exactly. So they all get to go back to their constituencies and get a huge amount of abuse, which
the House of Lords is only off for 3 days.
We're not off for 10. We're back on Monday.
Don't forget the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister did have an opportunity to put it right. He had the opportunity to come to the House of Commons yesterday, and he chose to be several hundred miles away.
And they're cross about that as well.
Yeah.
Lots of cross people about, but not on this panel. We'll move on in a moment. It's 8:48.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. LBC. Nick Ferrari.
For someone, why would you not have the jab? What is it? Why do you suppose we've done away with illnesses, smallpox and everything else? Because we've had vaccinations. So you have to get this done. And I have enormous sympathy for anyone who gets fired. I've been fired. It's not a pleasant thing. The solution is in your hand. Get the jab. Keep your job.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
Gordon Rayner, Daisy Cooper and Kate Green with me answering your questions. I've asked them for short answers so we can fit in as much as we can before we finish at 9. Diane is in Oxford and she sent in a text. Is there any point in COP26 or is it just a load of old men chatting? Kate Hoey.
Well, I must say I've not watched or listened to hardly any of it. Now, that's probably going to really make people angry out there. But, I never could understand why they needed so many people for so long to discuss something that, on the whole, if you take the view that things are really, really dangerous and bad, then why it wasn't more about the leaders of all the countries just getting together for a period of time. I couldn't understand who all these people were, all these delegates. You know, when I saw 150 people come from Zimbabwe.
150?
100, yeah, there's a picture today actually about it. I might be wrong, might be 130, but there was absolutely...
You're within
it's
the
been
margin
tweeted.
of
No,
error.
David Coulthard has tweeted it tonight from Zimbabwe. A lot of discussion is about things that maybe could have been sorted out or discussed without spending all this
basically,
money.
you agree with Greta Thunberg then? It's all a load of blah, blah, blah.
Well, funny enough, I'm not a great fan of hers, but I did think that was the act. That was.
I'm so
I thought the
surprised.
way she said blah 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 was actually a very good way of describing it. And to see all those jets coming in and all these people swanning in and swanning out, and the whole thing has just been a big sort of like Hollywood.
Daisy, the leader of the Green Council in Brighton, flew up to Glasgow by plane.
it's all
I mean, the
such
hypocrisy is unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, it's outrageous.
But that doesn't mean that we don't think that there is a problem about looking to see how we can ensure that the changes that are going to happen, that we can deal with it.
Okay.
But it's not the end of the world.
All right, Daisy.
Really, it's been made out as if the end of the world is going to happen in the next 20 years.
I think there are a lot of old men talking, but there's a lot of young people shouting at the same time. And young people are shouting because it's their future and they know how scary it looks. I mean, quite frankly, the government had one job to do. It had to mobilise global leaders to make commitments to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. And this morning, a bunch of scientists produced a report saying that the short-term commitments that have been made so far during COP are setting us on a path to a disastrous 2.4. And apparently tonight, the Prime Minister is on his way to Glasgow, to the COP26. Quite frankly, I think he should be going to Beijing because that's the way that he's going to get a better deal. So I think it's been very disappointing so far. I think it's unlikely that we're going to get any major commitments in the next few hours. But this fight will go on and on.
Well, there have been quite a lot of commitments, which, I mean, you mentioned a report there. There was another report that came out over the weekend that said, well, it was 2.5 degrees, and they're saying that it would be 1.8, so not 1.5, but that's a lot nearer than the report that you're quoting. Kate?
Well, we really need COP26 to make real progress. Kate says it's not the end of the world, but for many people around the world, it will mean drastic change in the quality of their lives, their living standards, and their sense of security about the future. And time is really against us. So Boris Johnson needs to be making sure that world leaders are coming together, achieving agreement and putting action behind their words. It's all very well to have targets for 2030 or 2050 or 2070, but we need the action now because time is really running out.
Gordon?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's been a waste of time. The ending deforestation by 2030, for example, I think that's great if they do it. And we don't know whether it's going to be a waste of time, unfortunately, until it's going to be too late to know whether it was a waste of time, because in 10 years' time, that will be when we know if they've kept the pledges. And by then, we don't know where we're going to be.
But I think we need a debate in this country, a real, genuine debate about what some of the things that the government's wanting to do and the climate change activists are wanting to do, how it's going to affect Joe Bloggs living in his council house.
Let's move on to Alex in Watford. Alex, hi, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, Ian and the panel. What more can Parliament do to support Richard Ratcliffe, who's on hunger strike outside the Iranian embassy?
He's actually outside the Foreign Office, I think. Kate?
Yeah, an immensely brave and dignified man, and everybody's heart goes out to the appalling situation that he and his family have been in for now 5 or 6 years. And the British government has to be engaging purposefully with Iran to find a solution to this horrific problem and get Nazanin home. We know that she's being used as a pawn in relation to an unpaid debt going way back to the time of the fall of the Shah. This has got to be a soluble matter for the British government, and we need to bring Nazanin back home so that she can be with her family and her daughter.
Gordon?
Well, I think in terms of what MPs can do, probably practically make sure there's somebody with him at all times, and hopefully several people with him at all times to support him and make sure he's okay, keep his spirits up. In terms of the geopolitics of it, I really don't know. I mean, the Iranians are clearly have no particular intention of releasing her as long as she's useful to them, and it's a tough one. I'm not a parliamentarian. I don't know the answer.
Daisy?
Well, I went to see Richard Ratcliffe this week. I was part of a cross-party delegation that went to see him. I think he's really struggling. He's really appreciated lots of MPs going to see him and showing their support, and by going to see him, they're understanding his struggle, but also raising awareness of his continuing plight. Quite frankly, MPs can continue to raise awareness, but it comes down to the government and what they're prepared to do. They need to sort this out and really up their diplomatic efforts.
Kate?
Well, I would think, if the new Foreign Secretary, who probably, understands this, the personal nature of it. Now, I'm being very sexist, but because she is a woman, I think she will understand this and really, really relate to what is happening. And why can't she simply get on a plane and go out to Iran?
Well, that has been done before,
yes,
hasn't
but
it?
why can't she do it again?
Well, maybe.
The new Foreign Secretary.
Well, I must admit, if I was Foreign Secretary, I'd be tempted to do that. But anyway, final text question from Alice in Edinburgh. Squid Game Series 2, I haven't watched it, has been confirmed by its creator. What's your favourite TV series at the moment? Daisy?
My husband and I are watching The Outlaws, which a group of individuals who, through various different routes, have ended up doing community service together. And it's a nice social commentary on some of the different wedge issues in our
society. I thought it was going to be a film about Conservative MPs for a minute. Kate Hoey.
Well, I'm very boring. It's Coronation Street. I will not miss Coronation Street.
Can't be more original than that.
No, I'm sorry, but that's about all my get round to watching.
Gordon?
Well, I'm a football fan. I've been watching Ted Lasso with my wife. We both enjoy it very much. I can recommend it to anybody who hasn't seen it yet.
Who do you support?
What's it called?
I support Newcastle. That's a whole other
That it really is.
Yes.
I was hoping you were going to say Liverpool for obvious reasons. But anyway, Kate.
Well, I'm delighted that Coronation Street is Kate's favourite programme because the street is in my constituency. You can come and see the set. But I'm a bit behind the curve here. I'm still catching up on the back numbers of Vigil, and I'm absolutely transfixed.
Yeah. Chesapeake Shores, can highly recommend it on Netflix. Thank you to Kate Hoey, Daisy Cooper, Kate Green and Gordon Rayner. We'll have you all back in future, particularly because Ruth in Watford gives you a 10 out of 10 as a panel. So well done for that. Coming up in a moment, we're going to be talking more about compulsory vaccinations for NHS workers and care workers. Is it the right thing to do, or do you have ethical worries about it? It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, NHS staff in England say they're worried colleagues